talk about deepening democracy, especially to a scholarly audience, I think we have to not necessarily define the words, but we need to have some idea of the concept we're talking about. What I certainly do not want to do is reproduce David Hell's wonderful book, Models of Democracy. I think it's now in its 5th edition, and you could not go beyond that book to understand the processes of democracy. But I wanted to look at 5 aspects, maybe, in my opinion, key formative aspects of democracy, because I think these are the things that we may need to deepen. So the question is, what is it that we want to deepen? And let me just begin with that. Now, the first one is rarely spoken about in democracy contexts. But the reality of our world is that we live in a Westphalian world of sovereign states. And the only democracy that we know is state-based democracy. We certainly do not have democracy at the global level. One of the key preconditions for a successful democracy is that it occur in a state. Now, when we talk about a state, I don't like the method of thinking of states of looking at a map and defining the states by its boundaries. What I like as a far more meaningful way of understanding what a state is to go to Benedict Anderson's ideas about nationalism. And what Benedict Anderson is saying is that these are constructs that exist not on a map, but in people's minds. They are imagined communities. And before you can have a successful democratic polity, you need its citizens to have a common imagined community of that state. And I say that because there are, sadly, quite a few places in the world which cannot sustain democracy because they are not imagined communities. Of course, people straight away think of a place like Somalia, which clearly does fit into that category. You cannot build institutions in Somalia because it's not only the peace problem, that the people don't think of the boundaries as some sort of meaningful entity for them. And closer to home, as an Australian, of course, we think a lot about Papua New Guinea. And Papua New Guinea is not an imagined community in the minds of the people who live there. They think much more in terms of their valley or their coastal villages, but they don't think of Papua New Guinea as a nation. And if you can't create that imagined community, it's very hard to create democracy. So that's the first one. The second key aspect, of course, I like to think of it from the perspective of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which says that the will of the people is the basis for the authority of government. And from that process, that concept of the will of the people, we have all that paraphernalia of democracy that we're familiar with: political parties, elections, parliaments, and so forth, all flow from the concept that the authority of government flows from the will of the people. So that's the second sort of aspect of democracy that we need to sort of focus on. The third, I think, is often seen as a parallel sort of concept. I like to think of democracy and rule of law, though, as mutually constitutive. They really help uphold, one upholds the other. Clearly, you cannot have democracy without rule of law, but not as clearly in people's minds, but I think, in fact, you cannot have rule of law without democracy, because the laws will not have legitimacy. It's democracy that gives the laws legitimacy, so you also need democracy for rule of law. The fourth aspect that I wanted to focus on as a key aspect of democracy is horizontal accountability. And horizontal accountability, I think the basic ingredient that we know of in our societies flows from the United States debates back in the 18th century, is the separation of powers between, in the American context, the three branches of government. But we've gone well beyond separation of powers in the three branches. We've gone to a point in modern democracies that John Keane describes in a new book, I think it came out 2 years ago, a wonderful book called The Life and Death of Democracy. And let me give you a spoiler, it's only death of democracy as we know it, because it's evolving to become something else. But what it's evolving to become is what John Keane calls monitory democracy, where there are so many institutions that monitor one aspect or another of the democratic construct. And so horizontal accountability, where we have all these institutions created to oversee each other and look at what they're doing and in some ways bolster one another, in other ways correct errors from one institution, but that is also a key element. And the final key element is what I think is best described as vertical accountability. So the horizontal accountability is among the institutions. Vertical accountability is to the people. It's a lot of what CREA does. It's what our social accountability project, regional project that the Democracy Fund is funding, does.